Howdy, friends. This is Matthew Sewell, and you're listening to episode 114 of The Popecast, a history of the papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non boring stories on the successors of St. Peter, and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. Well, it's safe to say that here in the 21st century, we're used to our popes having somewhat predictable backstories, shall we say. Entered the seminary at a young age, slowly rose through the ranks from priest to bishop to cardinal, and so on. But centuries ago, that wasn't always the case. Some had sordid backstories, fathering illegitimate children and living lives of ill repute, as we've covered some on the show in years past. And some simply pursued one vocation, only to have it ended suddenly by death, and then another one was presented to them. Well, that's the case with our man today, who was once married and became a father, only to have his wife suddenly die, and him soon realize a new calling altogether. This week on the Popecast, it's a widower who became Pope. Number 183, Pope Clement IV. One quick note before we get into it. If you're watching on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the Popecast channel. Thank you to everybody who has subscribed thus far since our last one. And be sure to leave a comment on this. If you're watching the video of this on YouTube, leave a comment after listening to let us know what you liked most about the episode. Spotify can also leave comments too, so a shout out to those of you who have left comments. We always appreciate getting those. Also, as far as a specific need in terms of supporting the show, we need to hire a part-time video editor to help get this content out to as many people as possible, clips, editing, all that sort of thing. So if you've been edified by the show and you haven't done so already and would like to help with that, the easiest way to make a one-time gift is really through Venmo. So it's just at the Popecast on Venmo. Or you can also sign up as a recurring subscriber over at popes.substack.com, where it starts at either, I think, $6 a month or $60 a year. So either of those, we'd be super grateful. Would love to get that person on board as quickly as we can. So regardless, thank you for listening. And now on to the show. Now, you'll have to forgive me for the pronunciation, but I think it's Guy Fawkes was born in Saint-Gilles on the southern border of modern-day France on November 23rd, 1190, to Pierre, a successful lawyer, and his wife, Marguerite. When Guy was just 19, he joined up to fight the Islamic Moors in Spain, making him, I think, one of the only future popes to have been a soldier prior to ascending the chair of St. Peter. Obviously, we know that there were popes who commanded armies when they were pope, but I don't know of very many. John the 23rd, interestingly enough, is one of the only examples I can think of who were soldiers in earlier life. But at any rate, after his military service, he followed in his dad's footsteps, studying law in Toulouse, Bourges, and Orleans before becoming a secretary to the great King of France, St. Louis IX, who would later become a great influence in his elevation to the cardinalate. At some point in Guy's early life, perhaps even when he was still a teenager, his mother died, which prompted his father to leave his career and enter the Carthusian order as a monk, where he would live out the rest of his days. Perhaps as a bit of foreshadowing, Guy himself was married and raised two daughters, as I mentioned at the top of the show. History tells us only that his wife suffered an untimely death, but we can safely assume that he lived the life of husband and father for many decades, in fact, before the end of her journey here on earth, given that his ordination to the priesthood didn't actually come until he was well into his 50s. While his daughters both entered the convent as nuns, Guy once again followed his father's example, devoting the rest of his life in service to the church. He was ordained a priest in 1247, served for a time as pastor of the parish in which he was raised, and was made Bishop of Le Puy in 1257, when he was nearly 70 years old. He was then promoted to Archbishop of Narbonne, 2 years later made cardinal after 2 more years in 1261, and not long after was sent on mission to England, Wales, and Ireland as papal legate. He was returning from England when Pope Urban IV died in 1264, so he incidentally was not even a participant in the conclave that would eventually elect him. When he received a message from the cardinals, you can imagine his surprise upon arriving in Perugia, where the conclave was being held, when he was informed that the votes were done and he was the guy who had been chosen. As the Catholic Encyclopedia recounts, quote, he was astonished, for only a man of his large experience could fully realize the responsibility of him whose judgment at this critical juncture must irrevocably shape the course of Italian and ecclesiastical history for centuries to come. His prayers and tears failing to move the cardinals, he reluctantly accepted the heavy burden, end quote. It was February 5th of 1265, and the new pope was 74 years old. But it was Viterbo, a city 40 miles north of Rome, where he would be crowned, taking the name of Clement IV in honor of the saint of his birthday, Pope St. Clement I, the fourth pope in history, and whose feast day is actually still celebrated on November the 23rd. Clement IV's reign would be a short one, at just over 3.5 years, and all contemporary accounts agree that he lived a disciplined life of prayer and piety, and in particular, he had an extreme hatred of nepotism of any kind, at a time when it was growing increasingly popular to grease the palms of one's extended family after gaining a position of power. And his was almost the impulse that so many advisors to young professional athletes preach these days. When people start coming out of the woodwork, now that you're into some money, tell them you don't have any and just keep walking. Well, once in office, a majority of his reign was taken up in dealing with the battle between Italian and French interests. Manfred, the grandson of Frederick Barbarossa, the illegitimate son of Frederick II, was in line to inherit the throne of Holy Roman Emperor, but he was referred to as the quote-unquote usurper of Naples by those loyal to the Pope, who instead favored St. Louis's brother, the French, Charles of Anjou. It was the latter who Clement IV threw his weight behind, which ultimately meant that he, the Pope of all people, would be unable to set foot in Rome for the entirety of his papacy. Yes, you heard that right. Clement IV never set foot in Rome one time while he was Pope. But at any rate, Charles went on to slay Manfred in the Battle of Benevento in 1266 and cemented his hold on the Kingdom of Sicily at the Battle of Tagliacozzo 2.5 years later in 1268, just months before Clement went on to his eternal reward. On the spiritual and intellectual side, Clement IV presided over perhaps the greatest advancements to date in both respects. One of the first acts after being elected was summoning the great St. Thomas Aquinas to Rome, fresh off his composition of the Tantum Ergo for Pope Urban IV, who had just promulgated the Feast of Corpus Christi. And so, Clement IV asked Thomas to serve as papal theologian. He also commissioned the Franciscan friar Roger Bacon to write a compilation of the items he had been studying, which was released in 1267, entitled Opus Majus, or Greater Work. It covered all portions of natural sciences, math, grammar, logic, physics, theology, and philosophy. It was 850 pages long, after all. And he also included at the beginning reasoning for why knowledge itself is a vital aspect of living a good human life, but also a good Christian life more specifically. A year later, Bacon would release another shorter work. I don't know if Clement thought it was too long, but it was called Opus Minus or Opus Minus. I'm not sure. But at any rate, a minor work, which summarized his earlier one, and the Opus Tertium as an introduction to the first two came a year or two after that. And perhaps the most interesting tidbit to us moderns, at least any Harry Potter fans in the audience, it was this pope who canonized Saint Hedwig. Yes, she's a real saint. She was the Queen of Poland. Clement IV canonized her in 1268. Historians, however, are unfortunately silent on her rumored love for owls. Well, Pope Clement IV died of what likely was natural causes on November 29th, 1268, just 6 days after his 78th birthday. He was buried in a Dominican convent at Viterbo, where he had spent his entire papacy. I can't help but find it interesting, just as a parting shot, that Clement spent 3/4 of his earthly life, nearly 60 years, in one vocation, only to find himself called in an entirely different direction. When he perhaps thought he had fulfilled the purpose of his life, that of a husband and a father, he was entering into its twilight, and then suddenly everything changed. And it was then that he was truly tested, undoubtedly like we all are even today. Will we shrivel in the face of adversity, or will we rise to the occasion, accepting with humility and grace, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, what God has prepared for those who love him? So that's it for the life of Pope Clement IV. Thank you for listening. Just a reminder again, if you like what you hear, please be sure to hit that subscribe button over at YouTube, on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you're listening to this. We'd love, again, if you left a comment, 5-star review. And lastly, if you'd like to support the work we do here, you can do that one-time gift over at Venmo. It's at the Popecast, or you can become a monthly subscriber, yearly subscriber over at popes.substack.com. Obviously, the show and the newsletter will always be free to readers. We want to make that super clear because that's super important to us. But time is very precious. It's not free to produce. And we'd like to continue to grow what we offer here. And we'd love for you to be a part of it. Well, as we head out today, let's remember the example of Pope Clement IV. And above all, never forget, these are strange times we live in, but they are no stranger than in ages past. Until next time.